welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of a fascinating book, somebody who is not just an author, but who has worn many hats and accomplished many things, and I am so excited to have this conversation. So welcome to our show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, this is Skiz Fernando, author of The Chronicles of Doom, Unraveling Rap's Masked Iconoclast.
When this book landed in my inbox, I was so excited. I am a huge MF Doom fan, and he's like a local, artist to us. He lived about like 30 minutes from where we are right now, in his early years. And I was so excited to learn so much more about his early life and really taking a deep dive into his artwork. Before we talk about the book itself, please tell us a little bit about yourself. You've had an extraordinary career as a producer, a label founder, a journalist, just to name a few things. Could you talk about what brought you to this project?
Yeah, sure. Well, everything that I'm involved in revolves around music. Music is kind of like my world. I grew up as a fan of music. I was lucky to have an older brother and sister who had pretty deep record collections, so I got into record buying pretty early. And I've always just been a fan of all types of music. And, eventually, high school era hip hop started coming on my radar. 80s hip hop, Run DMC, groups like that, Eric B. and Rakim. And I just kind of gravitated towards hip hop. And by the time I hit college, I was doing college radio. And I was actually doing a reggae show, but we had a very good hip hop show on my college station. It was run by two guys who eventually started the Source magazine,
Oh, wow.
John Schechter and Dave Mays. So when we graduated, ended up in New York, and through my connection to these guys, I ended up writing for the Source magazine. That was my first byline, and then eventually I started writing for all the magazines that were around then in the '90s. There were plenty of them, not like today, but. And that just basically, I was basically documenting the hip hop scene in New York in the '90s, which was pretty much the center of the hip hop universe at the time. And, I've been lucky enough to now in my later years actually write a couple books about hip hop, which has been so kind of influential to me and, kind of just give back to the whole movement and the culture. So this latest book about Doom is part of that whole effort to just kind of give back and.
That's really cool. And, it's so interesting to be documenting hip hop in New York at that time because, like, what an amazing transformation it went through in those years. And Doom was part of that. So could you talk a little bit about what drew you to him as an artist and then as a subject for a book?
Sure. Well, as you said, Doom was doing his thing in the '90s. Actually, he and his brother got a deal for their group in the late '80s, and they put out a record, I think in 1990, their first record on a major label, Elektra, because they had a connection with Third Base, who was already signed to Def Jam. So even before MF Doom, Daniel Dumile was involved in rap. His name was Zevlov X back then when he was with KMD. And he was basically laying the foundation for his career at the time. Unfortunately, he didn't even get a chance to release a second album. It was shelved over supposedly controversial artwork, which I go into that whole story in the book. And I lost track of Doom for several years during the '90s, as everyone did. But I was a huge fan of KMD, and I should say that they were on the cusp of really blowing up at the time. They were kind of loosely affiliated with a crew called the Native Tongues, which was kind of bringing a more abstract kind of friendlier version of hip hop into the scene as opposed to like gangster rap, which was happening big in the West Coast and eventually spread everywhere. But KMD was, it was kind of more of like a playful, quirky type of hip hop, and there was definitely an audience for it because you had groups like De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, Jungle Brothers, and to me, they were just like the next incarnation of the native tongue. So I was disappointed, when they kind of disappeared from the scene. And then I think it was like 1999. By that time, I had started a label and I was working with an artist called Prince Paul, who was the producer of De La Soul. I actually gave him a chance to do his first solo record on my label, Word Sound. And I think Paul was the one who actually told me that Zevlov X was back in a new identity as this masked rapper MF Doom. And he put out a series of singles on Babito Garcia's label Fondulum, an independent label, and I heard those. And then he put out the album Operation Doomsday, and I was like, when I heard the full album, I was like, wow, this guy Doom has really reinvented himself. I mean, he sounded nothing like his former self. And from that point on, I started following his career as MF Doom throughout the early 2000s when he was releasing, he put out like 6 or 7 records on 6 different independent labels. I thought it was just incredible because at the time I was running my own independent label and I was like, the challenge is how do you promote your records? How do you get the name of your artist out there? And Doom seemed to be doing it effortlessly. I mean, he wasn't really resting on his laurels of the KMD days. He was, like I said, he created a whole new persona, a whole new vibe, and he was just really infiltrating the whole music landscape with that, coming with different characters, names on different labels, but all the same person. So I was just enthralled by this character. And long story short, when I heard that he died in at the end of 2020, I was shocked because this is a guy who's younger than me. He's like one of my contemporaries, and I felt he was just hitting his stride. After all of that work and reinvention, I felt like he was just getting back into things, and he was just getting started, and then his life was snuffed out. So like everyone else, I started listening to the podcast that came out in early 21, kind of paying homage to Doom. And I realized that this guy had such an incredible backstory
Mhm.
that he really deserved a book. So I had just finished writing about Wu-Tang Clan, who I had spent a lot of time with in the 90s, and I did a lot of interviews with the guys, and I really had a lot of material on Wu-Tang to write a book. With this book, I had nothing to start with really.
Yeah.
And as you know, Doom is a very mysterious character. He's created this mystique around him, and it was not easy to find out about his life and his work. So it was a challenging job that I set myself up for.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet. And I think that the book does a really great job of getting behind the masks, as it were, but also like honoring that sort of air of mystery and like maintaining it. And I think that's a really lovely line that you walk.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that because it was a tough line to balance, because on one hand, I'm a fan. I want to know about this guy. On the other hand, I'm a person who's experienced close deaths in the family. I know how that affects one. Daniel lost not only his brother, who was his partner in music, later on, he lost a 14-year-old son. So, I feel for the guy. I know what that's like. And I wanted to, honor as much of the privacy as I could. So
Yeah, absolutely. For somebody whose life was really marked by loss in some really real ways, he is also, like in his music, so resilient. And you have that great quote, I think, I don't know if I think it's toward the end from Dr. Patrick Graham, who says, his life and art symbolize the resilience we need in our present context. And I think that's so like really fitting and really lovely. And I think it speaks to, how all of those masks and the physical mask he wore and all the different identities, like how they both functioned for him personally and professionally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. And he was a guy who just to me his life was an example, like and it even transcends hip hop because he was a guy who started off on one track, which was music, and he initially he succeeded, but then he kind of got cut off from that path.
Mhm.
And any normal person would probably find something else to do, and just like go off and do something else. This guy stuck to his guns and he reinvented himself and he built himself back bigger and better than before. And he had such an impact on the art form that he loved. That's a real inspiration to anyone who's trying to do something and they initially fail. Come back harder and try harder. Where there's a will, there's a way, basically. And Doom was like proof of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like what a will. You were saying before that, he was cut off so young and he still had so much art left in him. But he produced so much in that short amount of time that he was producing work, just so prodigious. Could you talk a little bit more about, what makes his rap so unique? Like I love his rhymes. He's also very funny and he uses really like complex word choices. Could you talk a little bit about like what it is that he brought to the medium?
Yeah, sure. To me, Daniel really distinguished himself from all the other MCs out there. First and foremost, because he rapped in the third person, which is something a lot of people don't realize. He's he rarely says, I did this, I did that. It's always he, the third person. He's talking about Doom. He's talking about the character Doom. I thought that was such an ingenious thing because in interviews he always said, I'm not rappers always try to make you believe that they're the guy who's saying everything, and it's like a macho posturing thing. But for Doom, he was basically writing a character. So that's why he used the third person. I thought that was just ingenious because if you approach rap like that, you can inhabit any character you want, which is what he eventually did. He was King Ghidorah, the three-headed flying dragon from outer space, which is pretty outrageous. He was he was a younger version of himself, Vic Vaughn, and just to have that, just to have a mind like that, to think so far outside the box that you can reinvent yourself and portray all these other characters, I thought was pretty amazing. Another thing that you hit on also was his humor. I think most of his rhymes it's almost like a stand-up comedy routine. He's dropping these couplets fast and before you even kind of decode one, he's on to the next thing, and it's like you're playing catch up the whole time with his lyrics. And his lyrics really demand further investigation because they are so funny and they are so clever. He uses a lot of internal rhymes, a lot of onomatopoeia, a lot of alliteration, which is having several words in the same line rhyme, and not many rappers do that. And Doom was a guy, he didn't only carry thesaurus, he used to carry around these other books like a dictionary of put downs and insults. And also, I mean, what other rapper does that? It's like to me, he was a true MC in the sense that he was so committed to the craft of writing, much more so than any MC that I've ever come across in all of hip hop. And I think that's why people appreciate him because he's 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 often self-deprecating, making fun of himself, which rappers don't do a lot of the time. Rappers are very serious and take themselves very seriously. Doom is very funny, and he just has this amazing imagination, and it just yeah, I mean that's pretty much that's how he's so different from everyone else. And to me, he's like really kind of transcended hip hop at this point because he has fans outside of hip hop. People who don't even listen to hip hop listen to Doom. And now something I'm finding is that young kids are getting interested in Doom. And to me, he's the perfect guy to introduce someone to rap, a kid to rap, because he's kind of more wholesome. He doesn't curse, he's funny, he's engaging. So that's to me, that makes perfect sense that young people would be getting into Doom because he's a great kind of introduction, to the whole art form.
Oh, absolutely. And the comics references, and that's my next
Oh yeah.
question too, is how new was it at the time to be incorporating references to comics into rap at the time? I know that he was absolutely doing it to a larger extent than anybody else, but I'm curious about that and the impact that that had on later rappers, because one of my contemporary favorites who also collaborated with him is Czarface, who also uses a lot of like comic imagery and in his identity. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a very important part of Doom. And I think that's really an area that he monopolized and really brought to the forefront his interest in cartoons and comic books and animation. Usually we associate this stuff with nerd culture, okay? And Doom was the first to say that he's the clever nerd, you know, best MC without a mask you ever heard. So to me, he kind of brought nerd culture under the big tent of hip hop. Before it was all about being cool, it was all about posturing, it was like a very macho thing. I think Doom gave license to people, gave license to anyone to really listen to hip hop and appreciate it for what it was, because he brought something new to the game. And he was definitely not the first rapper to have this connection with comic books and cartoons. That's always been a big influence behind hip hop. But he had a almost obsession with it. And it's like he really borrowed a lot from cartoons, from comic books, not only for his name, Doom, which is, based on the Marvel character Doctor Doom, but he would sample a lot of vocal snippets from these Hanna-Barbera cartoons. He would sample music from cartoons. And to me, that's ingenious because that's like a sample source I think that a lot of producers never even thought of mining. So that's why I say Doom kind of monopolized that part, and he brought it fully into hip hop where it was obviously embraced, and now it's as much a part of hip hop as like kung fu movies, that the Wu-Tang Clan brought in. That was always also another big influence behind hip hop, and it's like a recognized part of it. So the same thing with cartoons and comic books with Doom.
I always like really love that about his music and the samples from like, movies and TV and stuff like that. One of the first songs I remember hearing, I think it was probably in college for me, which is 20 years ago, but That's That, the song That's That. And it ends with a movie quote from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And that was the first movie I ever saw in movie theaters, like back in 1988. It is still my favorite movie to this day. And I'm like, it's so cool the way that like, he draws on so many different cultural sources. And then the fact that he's quoting Judge Doom in that movie is like a pun on his own name. Like it's all just so clever and it has so many layers to it.
Exactly. And I think that's what people appreciate about Doom. There's so many levels to it, and it's music that in order to really appreciate, you have to really investigate it more. It's not background music. It's something that's really engaging and really draws you in. And you end up doing research, even some of the non-funny stuff, even some of the non-funny references that Doom drops. I found myself researching people like Henrietta Lacks. Do you know who Henrietta Lacks is?
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Mhm.
He drops her name, and I think it's a song "Winter Blues," which is like a really heartfelt ode to his wife. He wrote it when he was living in England. He had been deported to England, and he was separated from his wife and family. And anyway, the song mentions this Henrietta Lacks, and I was like, "Who's that?" So I looked it up, and she's this African American lady who had cancer, and Johns Hopkins University had used her cells for research without her permission. And only recently, only like a couple years ago, did they make a formal apology to her family for doing that, because this lady's cells were used in cancer research and for all of these, advances in the medical field. So it's like, for Doom to drop a reference like that is like, wow, that gives you an example of how atypical, the references that he dropped were. Whereas a normal rapper might drop the name of a drug dealer or like a villainous movie character or something. Doom also had this other kind of serious side where he was really dropping a lot of information too.
Absolutely. Yeah, the humor coexists with like a really serious message too. And, I think that really speaks to the complexity, not just of like his words and his beats, but of like the overall message and themes of his work for sure.
Right. He was a real conceptual artist, which is rare in this genre, because it's usually pretty kind of black and white, but Doom really painted with a lot of colors. So
Yeah, and this book is such a lovely dive into his life. I think that like if you are familiar with his work, you learn a lot more about his life and the meaning that went into it. But even if you aren't, I think it's also just a really great work of like hip hop history and sort of a look at, a genre like in a particular period of time. So thanks so much for coming to talk about it and for sharing your work with our listeners. I'm very excited to recommend it to our patrons.
hey, thanks for having me. I love to talk about Doom, and I love to put new people onto him. So hopefully, people listening to this will go out and buy some of his records and check him out, because he's an artist who's not to be missed in any genre.
Absolutely. All right, so listeners, you heard that. It is now on you. Please check out The Chronicles of Doom, Unraveling Rap's Masked Iconoclast. It's out now. It'll be out when you hear this episode, so head to your favorite bookstore or website or library if you like to get your books there. Thank you so much for joining us. It is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.